Good morning and welcome to this week's Micro Moment Monday, where we are going to talk just a little bit about something that has to do with food security, and that is flat sour. I know some of you are going, what? What is flat sour? Flat sour is not well known across the canning communities. A lot of people know about it, but I've had lots of questions about it when I have mentioned it before in canning. However, recently, due to some of the comments that I have been reading on our videos, a lot of people are placing themselves in a situation where flat sour may develop within the jars of their canned food. So first of all, what is flat sour? Well, it is a condition to where the food on the inside of your jars tastes sour-ish, fermented-ish, nasty-ish. And maybe you can't figure out what on earth happened. This just doesn't taste the way it should. So if you are getting a strange taste, if it tastes a little bit sour, you may be doing something with your canning jars that creates that situation. So flat sour is caused by a family of bacteria known as the Bacillus organisms. Bacillus is a family of bacteria, and they are thermophiles. This particular group are thermophiles, meaning thermoheat philes loving. They are heat loving. They love heat. They do their best work, which is detrimental to us in the heat, but they are not at all harmful. It's not going to hurt you. It's not going to kill you. There's no threat or danger like there is with botulism. They survive canning because they are so heat loving. Boy, they're in their element in that pressure canner in particular when it gets up so high. They love it. So what the canning experts across the USDA and BAL and the state extension offices all talk about avoiding flat sour by pulling those jars out of the canner as quickly as you can and placing them in a situation where they can cool quickly. Now, we do not ever violate the rule that is hard and fast about letting the canner, pressure canners, cool down to where there is zero pressure inside. And then the recommendation, and it varies among experts, is whether we're water bath canning or pressure canning, to once the heat is off, and for pressure canning, once the pressure is all the way down, to allow the jars just to sit in the canner for between 5 and 20 minutes. That's the range of what experts say. So 5 minutes is more on the water bath side, 20 minutes is more on the pressure canning side. But for pressure canning, the rule is always to allow the pressure to move down to zero pressure naturally. Don't do anything artificial. Don't run it under water. Don't put it in a cold place. Just leave it on the stove, leave it alone until that pressure is all the way down. Now, I've recently done some pressure canning with chicken broth and with potatoes that we have videos on. And we had a little bit of previous trouble with my Nesco. I call it my troublemaker canner, and a couple of you picked up on that and you have a Nesco that's a troublemaker as well. One woman has two she has two Nescos. One is a troublemaker and one is nice and obedient, so I got a laugh out of that. So canners differ. Even the same brand, make, and model differ from one another, and that makes a lot of sense. So we need now to know how to avoid the development of flat sour by removing our jars from the canner. And the thing that has been a little bit alarming to me is that we've had some of our viewers say, oh, I just leave mine in the canner overnight, or I leave mine untouched in the canner for 3 or 4 hours to be sure it's calmed down. Well, that's plenty of time for flat sour to develop. It's called flat, as in flat sour, because these bacillus microorganisms do not create a gas. And so your lid is never going to puff and break seal. Now, your shelf should look like this with the rings off. I just store mine loosely on, not tied down, so that if it's going to break seal, it doesn't have any impediment to doing that by the ring holding it down. But I don't have a lot of places to store hundreds of these, so I just store them right on the jars. And if you have an organism inside that is a gas-producing microorganism, then it's going to puff up and break that seal. Bacillus bacteria don't do that. These thermophiles don't do that. So the lid stays flat. So that is why it's called flat sour. Flat is no gas producing. Sour is the result of your food, what happens to your food if you don't cool your canning jars down soon enough. So how do we go about doing that? Now, several of you have the Nesco, and I got a lot of I started to talk about the problems we've had because my canner is a little bit of a troublemaker. And that only is when I'm canning broth. At all other times, it behaves itself just fine. But when I can broth in the Nesco, sometimes I get that explosive lateral siphoning. And I had a lot of people tell me a lot of things about how to stop that. And several people mentioned, well, it says in the instruction book to let it rest for an hour after. Well, I was assuming that perhaps they meant to let it sit for an hour after the pressure has dropped all the way to zero. But that is not what it says. I want to read you exactly what it says because they said, well, that's in the instruction book. So here's my Nesco. This is on page 12, and this is after it is already done. This is number G at the bottom of the page. And this is when the time is up and it says off. Unplug the pressure canner and allow the temperature and pressure inside the canner to gradually decrease. Do not manually release the pressure. The canner should be allowed to cool for 1 hour before attempting to opening the lid. Okay, so it has been cooling since the heat went off. What this doesn't mean is let it come to zero pressure and then leave it in there another hour. It's saying to just let it come to zero and cool for an hour, all in one fell swoop. Well, my Nesco doesn't cool down in an hour. Maybe yours cools down in less than an hour, in which case go ahead and leave it for an hour. That's not going to hurt. But what will give flat sour an opportunity to develop is if you leave it in the canner for another hour after it goes to zero. My Nesco takes between an hour and 15 minutes to get to zero pressure. And then at that time, I will leave it for another about 10 minutes. Or if you saw the video with the, just this past few days ago, when I was doing the big batch chicken broth, I put a knife under the lid and let the lid sit for about another 5 minutes. So I give it time, but I would never give it an hour, ever, because that just gives flat sour an opportunity to develop. Now I'm going to tighten that down for a minute so I don't drop it. So when we take hot jars out of the canner and put them on a countertop, and I always put mine on a rack so that air can get underneath, then air can get all around it. But I want to talk to you about what is happening right here. This is hot. It's very hot. A lot of times it's over 200 degrees when you're taking it out of the canner, which is boiling. We've got some super boiling that's going on the inside. And so when we take it out of the canner and set it on the rack to cool, here are things that you do not do. Do not stack your cooling jars close together. Because what's happening here, this is hotter than the air around. And so the heat transfer from this jar is moving from high concentrated heat to less concentrated, from warmer to cooler. It moves outward in this direction. And in fact, it makes like a cushion of hot air all around the jar as that heat moves out. Now, that is why some of you have seen me, I can with my Presto stovetop canner outside in the canning station that Jim built for me, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago. And I can year round, even in the wintertime. And some people say, oh no, you can't take the jars out on a cold winter day, even when it's snowing, and put on a table and just let them cool out there. Well, yes, you can. You absolutely can. Because that cold air won't touch those jars. When I put it out on the table and it's been out in the canner is hot, the jars are 200 degrees, the cold air can't get into it because it has this cushion of warm air. Now, what happens is, now if the wind is blowing, that's altogether different. If the wind is blowing, if there's a breeze blowing, it's going to blow that cushion of hot air aside, and cold air will get to it. So I would never do that on a windy day or with a breezy day. But if it's still outside, I can leave these out for at least an hour before I need to bring them in because it may be cold. I've taken jars out of the canner in freezing weather and let them sit out there to cool for about an hour before I bring them in the house, and they're still warm to the touch. So we don't want to do this. Another thing we don't want to do is to throw a towel over the top of them. That holds the heat in and allows those little nasty thermophiles to do their thing and give your food flat sour because you have held the heat in. What we want to do is to space them apart and let them cool down to room temperature. Once we get below about 80 degrees, once they've cooled down to that, then there's no more danger of flat sour. But if you're leaving them in the canner for an extra hour, or 2 or 3 or 4, or overnight, that's an open invitation. So that's what flat sour is. And so the way to prevent it is to take your jars out of the canner as soon as you can and allow them to cool naturally on a rack, and then make sure that there's plenty of airspace between so that they can cool. We want to get them as cool as possible. And this is not a panic thing. Just use good common sense. Space them, don't put anything over them, walk away and let them cool down, but don't leave them in the canner. So that will prevent a flat sour from occurring. So that's the information on flat sour and how easy it is to avoid that situation. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next Monday for another Micro Moment.